Today we will explore how medieval peasants managed to survive Europe's harshest winters, using ingenious techniques that defied the simplicity of the materials at their disposal. What lies behind these solutions might surprise even contemporary engineers and architects. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is something deeply unsettling about imagining a medieval European winter. Not the winter we know today, softened by heating systems, high-tech synthetic clothing, and hermetically sealed houses. We are talking about something very different. A winter that arrived like a sentence, a period when the temperature plummeted to well below zero, when the days shortened until they seemed like mere intervals between long and merciless nights, and when the snow covered everything with a silence that was not peace but a threat. For the vast majority of the European population between the 5th and 15th centuries, this was the scenario that repeated itself year after year, and there was no guarantee that everyone would survive to see the spring. Medieval peasants represented the overwhelming majority of the population. They were farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen of simple trades. They lived in small villages, often composed of no more than 20 or 30 families, scattered across the rural landscape of England, France, the region we now call Germany, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Nordic countries. Their houses were not made of dressed stone or uniform bricks. They were modest constructions, built with the materials that the surrounding land offered. And yet these buildings had to fulfill a function that was, literally, a matter of life or death, keeping their residents warm when the world outside turned into a hostile and frozen place. What makes this story so fascinating is not simply the fact that these people survived, it is how they survived. Because, over centuries, medieval peasants developed a set of practices, techniques, and knowledge that, seen through the eyes of modern science, reveal a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the principles of thermodynamics, thermal engineering, and bioclimatic architecture. They did not know these terms, of course. They had no books, equations, or laboratories. But they possessed something equally valuable, the accumulated experience of generations, passed down from parents to children, from grandparents to grandchildren, in a chain of practical wisdom that spanned centuries. And it all began with the walls. When we think of a medieval peasant house, the image that usually comes to mind is that of a fragile structure vulnerable to wind and cold. And in a way, the appearance of these constructions fed that impression. They were low houses, with sloped roofs that almost touched the ground in some regions, irregular walls and narrow doors. But this appearance was deceiving. Behind that rustic surface, there was a construction technique that combined ingenuity and efficiency in a way that deserves to be understood in detail. The technique in question was known as wattle and daub. The principle was elegantly simple. First, the builders drove vertical wooden stakes into the ground, forming the skeleton of the wall. Then they wove thin, flexible rods between these stakes. The woods most commonly used for this weaving were willow and hazel, trees abundant in much of Europe, whose young branches possessed the necessary flexibility to be bent and braided without breaking. The result was a firm weave, reminiscent of large-scale basketry, a wall made of living wood, with the structural strength necessary to support the weight of the roof, and at the same time, the malleability to absorb the natural movements of the building over time. But the wooden weave was only the beginning. The next stage was the application of the plaster, and it is here that the technique reveals its full intelligence. The material used was a mixture made from ingredients that were available to any peasant, without the need for purchase or trade. Clay taken directly from the ground, straw cut from the fields after the harvest, water from the nearest river or well, and, in many cases, animal dung. This mixture, which at first glance might seem primitive or even repulsive to modern sensibilities, was actually a composite of remarkable thermal efficiency. The clay provided the adhesive base and the structural mass of the plaster. The straw functioned as a reinforcing agent, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried, similar to the role that fiberglass plays in contemporary reinforced concrete. The animal dung, in turn, was not added out of carelessness or lack of options. It fulfilled specific functions. The fibers present in cattle and horse manure increased the cohesion of the mixture, while the material's natural chemical compounds contributed to water resistance and even to the flexibility of the plaster after it dried. This mixture was applied over the wooden weave in successive layers, filling every crevice with firm and careful pressure. The result, after weeks of natural drying, was a solid wall, surprisingly resistant and thermally efficient. The secret of this efficiency lay in a physical principle that the peasants understood intuitively, even without knowing it by name. Trapped air is one of the best thermal insulators in existence, and the combination of the wooden weave with the clay plaster created exactly that. A wall full of tiny air pockets, trapped between the straw fibers, in the interstices of the weaving and in the natural irregularities of the plaster. These air pockets functioned as a barrier against heat transfer, preventing the heat generated inside the house from escaping to the outside and, at the same time, making it difficult for the external cold to enter. The thermal performance of these walls was comparable to that of many insulation systems used in modern buildings. Studies conducted by researchers of historical architecture have demonstrated that a well-built wattle and daub wall could offer a level of insulation similar to that of contemporary walls with basic insulation, and all this was achieved with materials that cost literally nothing, collected a short distance from the house itself. There was no need for long-distance transport, specialized suppliers, or financial investments. The earth, the wood, and the straw were there, within reach, waiting to be transformed into protection against the cold. The durability of these constructions was another remarkable aspect. When well maintained, wattle and daub houses could last for centuries. The most famous example is probably the birthplace of William Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. Built in the 16th century, this building used the wattle and daub technique in much of its structure, and it remains standing today, more than 400 years later, as a silent testament to the efficacy of this construction technique that has so often been dismissed as primitive. But the walls were only the first layer of protection. Above them, there was another equally crucial element for the peasants' survival during the winter, and this element grew in the fields they themselves cultivated. The roof of a medieval peasant house was not made of ceramic tiles, slate, or any other material that required specialized manufacturing. These materials were reserved for the wealthier classes, for manor houses, monasteries, and churches. The peasants covered their houses with straw. And this choice, which at first glance might seem like the simplest and most precarious of solutions, was actually a demonstration of ingenuity that deserves careful examination. The technique of building straw roofs, known as thatching in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, was a craft passed down from generation to generation. The craftsmen responsible for this task were not improvised amateurs. They were specialists who mastered a complex art, with precise rules regarding the selection of materials, the preparation of bundles, the slope of the roof, and the technique of overlapping layers. A good thatched roof was not simply a pile of plant material thrown over the structure of the house. It was a work of natural engineering, designed to fulfill multiple functions simultaneously. The materials most commonly used varied by region. In areas where wheat was grown, the stalks remaining after the harvest were the preferred material. In regions near rivers and marshes, reeds provided an excellent alternative. In other locations, rye, barley, or even heather were used. Each material had its own characteristics of durability, water resistance, and insulation capacity, and the thatchers knew these properties with the precision of those who depended on this knowledge to survive. The construction process began with the preparation of the bundles. The stalks or reeds were gathered into compact bunches, tied firmly, and left to dry completely before application. Drying was a fundamental stage, as wet material rotted quickly and lost its insulating properties. Once dry, the bundles were positioned over the roof structure in overlapping layers, starting from the bottom and moving up toward the ridge. Each layer overlapped the previous one, creating a runoff system that prevented rainwater infiltration. The thickness of a well-built thatched roof was impressive. In many regions, the layer of straw measured between 30 and 45 centimeters. In some exceptional cases, it could exceed 50 centimeters. This thickness was not a whim or an exaggeration. It was a functional necessity. The thicker the layer of straw, the greater the amount of air trapped between the stalks, and therefore the greater the thermal insulation capacity of the roof. A thatched roof, 40 centimeters thick, offered a level of insulation superior to that of many modern roofs without additional insulation. But thermal insulation was only one of the virtues of this system. Straw possessed a property that made it particularly suitable for the European climate: the ability to regulate humidity. Unlike impermeable materials, which can trap moisture inside the building and create favorable conditions for the development of mold and fungi, straw allowed air to circulate naturally through the roof. The excess humidity generated inside the house by the residents' breathing, by cooking food, and by the heat of the hearth could gradually escape through the layers of straw, keeping the internal environment in a healthy, hygroscopic balance. At the same time, the technique of overlapping layers prevented rainwater from penetrating the interior. Water ran off the external surface of the stalks, following the path determined by the slope of the roof, without ever reaching the internal layers. The durability of these roofs varied depending on the material used and the quality of construction. But even in the most adverse conditions, a well-made thatched roof could last between 10 and 15 years without the need for complete replacement. In drier regions and with higher quality materials, such as water reeds, the lifespan could reach 25 or even 30 years. And when the time came for maintenance or reconstruction, the work was frequently carried out as a community effort. The entire village would gather to help with the task, transforming what could be an individual burden into a collective event, accompanied by shared meals, songs, and stories. This social aspect of roof maintenance reinforced the community bonds that were, as we will see later, another fundamental pillar of survival during the winter. The materials, it is worth reiterating, cost nothing beyond the labor of collection and preparation. Straw was a byproduct of agriculture, available in abundance after each harvest. What modern farmers might consider agricultural waste was, for medieval peasants, an invaluable resource. Every stalk used was one less stalk of cold in the following winter. It was a circular economy in its purest and most efficient form, centuries before this concept was formalized by contemporary environmentalist thought. The wattle and daub walls and the thatched roofs together formed the protective envelope of the medieval peasant house. But an envelope, however efficient it may be, does not generate heat, it only retains it. For there to be heat to be retained, a source was necessary. And this source occupied the most important place in the entire house. In the exact center of the peasant dwelling, directly on the packed earth floor, burned the fire of the hearth. This was not a fireplace like the ones we know today, framed in stone or brick, with a chimney that conducts smoke out of the house. In the early and middle centuries of the Middle Ages, most peasant houses did not have a chimney. The hearth was simply an open area in the center of the room, sometimes delimited by a few stones arranged in a circle where the fire was kept burning throughout the cold season. The smoke rose naturally toward the roof, escaping through the natural openings in the straw and eventually through holes intentionally left in the ridge. This central arrangement was not accidental. It was the result of impeccable thermal logic. A fire positioned in the center of the house distributed heat more uniformly than a fire placed against a wall. The heat radiated in all directions simultaneously, reaching every corner of the room. The smoke, as it rose, heated the air in the upper layers of the house before escaping through the roof. The thatched roof, with its thick, insulating layer, retained part of this heat, creating a kind of thermal cushion under which the residents lived and slept. It was a heating system rudimentary in its appearance, but ingenious in its operation. The smoke, despite its obvious drawbacks for the respiratory health of the residents, also fulfilled an additional practical function. As it passed through the layers of the thatched roof, it deposited a thin layer of soot on the stalks. This soot acted as a natural waterproofing agent, making the roof more resistant to water penetration over time. Furthermore, the chemical properties of the smoke helped repel insects and slow the decay of the roof's organic material. It was a side benefit that the peasants likely observed and valued, even if they could not explain it in scientific terms. Fire management was a skill learned from childhood. Keeping a hearth burning throughout the winter required a delicate balance. A fire that was too large consumed excessive fuel and represented a real fire risk, especially in a house with wooden walls and a thatched roof. A fire that was too small did not provide enough heat to warm the environment and its occupants. Peasants learned to read the flames with the same attention a sailor reads the wind. The color of the flame, the speed of combustion, the behavior of the smoke, all of this provided information about the intensity of the fire and the need for adjustments. The fuel used varied by region and availability. In forested areas, wood was the primary fuel, but wood was not always available in sufficient quantities, especially for the poorest peasants, who did not have free access to the Lord's forests. In these circumstances, they turned to alternatives. Peat was one of the most important. Extracted from marshy areas and peat bogs, peat is essentially partially decomposed plant matter accumulated over thousands of years. When dry, it burns slowly and steadily, producing less instantaneous heat than wood but maintaining combustion for much longer periods. A well-prepared block of peat could burn for hours, providing a moderate and continuous heat that was ideal for warming a house during the night. There was also the use of dried dung as fuel, a common practice in regions where both wood and peat were scarce. Cattle dung, when completely dry, burned surprisingly efficiently, although with an odor that would not be tolerated by modern olfactory sensitivities. For medieval peasants, however, this odor was just another characteristic of winter, as natural as the smell of wet earth in spring. The technique of banking the fire during the night was particularly important. Before retiring to sleep, family members would cover the embers with a layer of ash. This covering reduced the flow of oxygen, slowing the intensity of combustion without extinguishing it completely. The embers continued to smolder slowly under the protection of the ash, maintaining a remnant of heat during the coldest hours of the early morning. In the morning, it was enough to remove the ash and blow on the embers to revive the fire. This technique saved the arduous and time-consuming work of lighting a new fire every day, a task that, without matches or lighters, required the use of flint and steel, or the friction of wood, methods that could take several minutes of concentrated effort in ideal conditions, and much longer on frozen mornings with fingers numbed by the cold. The central hearth was also the social heart of the house. It was around the fire that the family gathered at the end of the day. It was there that children listened to stories told by their elders, that women worked on spinning and weaving by the light of the flames, and that men repaired tools and planned the next day's activities. The hearth was not just a source of heat, it was the convergence point of domestic life, the axis around which the entire existence of the family revolved during the long winter months. The warmth it provided was not just physical, it was also emotional and social, a constant reminder that even in the heart of the harshest winter, there was a center of light and life. But the heat of the hearth had its limits. As the embers faded and the night advanced, the cold began to creep through the crevices of the house, rising from the dirt floor and descending from the roof as the layer of heated air dissipated. It was during these hours that the peasants turned to an additional resource, a technique as simple as it was effective, which transformed the very stones of the field into portable heat sources. The practice of heating stones in the fire and using them as a heat source during the night is one of the oldest and most universal heating strategies known to humanity. Medieval peasants elevated it to a refined form of domestic art. The process was straightforward. During the day, while the hearth was in full use to cook food and heat the house, carefully selected stones were placed directly in the embers or near the fire, where they absorbed heat over several hours. The selection of the stones was not random. The peasants knew that stones that were too porous could crack when heated, and that stones that were too light did not retain enough heat. The ideal stones were dense, smooth, and compact. River pebbles were particularly valued, as the millennial action of the water had already tested their resistance to extreme thermal variations. Once sufficiently heated, the stones were removed from the fire with wooden tongs or wrapped in thick cloths, and then placed under the bed covers or inside clay containers that functioned as precursors to modern hot water bottles. The physical principle behind this practice is that of thermal inertia. Dense materials absorb large amounts of energy and release it slowly and gradually. A medium-sized river stone, heated over an afternoon, could radiate heat for 6 to 8 hours, long enough for an entire night's sleep. This practice represented a significant fuel saving. Instead of keeping the hearth burning at high intensity throughout the night, The family could rely on the heated stones to provide warmth during sleep. It was a form of thermal energy storage, a concept that modern engineering celebrates as an innovation in the field of energy efficiency, but which medieval peasants had already been practicing for centuries. The use of heated stones was not exclusive to the Middle Ages. This practice continued to be used by rural populations until the 20th century. There are reports of families who, even during the first decades of the last century, heated bricks in the oven and wrapped them in towels for winter nights. It is further evidence that the knowledge of medieval peasants was not a relic, but a living legacy. But heated stones, however effective they were, represented only one piece of the mosaic. Medieval peasants did not rely on a single strategy to face the winter. They combined multiple solutions, creating an integrated system of protection against the cold that extended far beyond the walls of the house. And one of the most fascinating dimensions of this system concerned how the houses and villages themselves were positioned in the landscape. The choice of location to build a house was not a decision taken lightly. For a medieval peasant, this decision could mean the difference between a family that thrived and one that suffered. And although the factors influencing this choice were multiple, including proximity to water sources, the quality of the soil for cultivation, and accessibility to paths and markets, the orientation of the house in relation to the sun and the wind was one of the most important. The careful observation of solar behavior throughout the seasons was fundamental knowledge that every peasant possessed. They knew, through experience passed down over generations, that during the winter months in the northern hemisphere, the sun traveled a low trajectory in the sky, leaning heavily toward the south. A house whose main facade faced south received significantly more direct sunlight during the winter than a house oriented in any other direction. This sunlight, as it hit the walls and penetrated the openings, contributed to the passive heating of the house's interior. The thick walls of stone and clay functioned as natural thermal accumulators. During the sunny hours, they absorbed the heat from solar radiation, storing it in their dense mass. As the afternoon progressed and the external temperature began to drop, these walls gradually released the accumulated heat into the interior of the house, prolonging the effect of solar heating for hours after sunset. It was the same principle of thermal inertia that made heated stones so effective, now applied on an architectural scale. The windows of peasant houses were small, much smaller than the windows we are accustomed to in modern buildings. This characteristic, which is often interpreted as a technological or aesthetic limitation, was actually a deliberate design decision. Large windows meant large openings through which internal heat could escape. In an age when glass was an inaccessible luxury for most peasants, windows were covered with oiled leather, waxed cloth, paper, or simply left open during the day and closed with wooden shutters at night. The smaller the window, the smaller the heat loss. And the position of these small openings was carefully calculated to maximize the entry of morning sunlight, the time of day when the house most needed heating after the long hours of the night. Protection against the wind was another crucial element in the positioning of houses. The dominant winter winds in Europe came predominantly from the north and northeast, bringing with them the icy air from the Arctic and subarctic regions. Peasants positioned their houses so that the most solid walls with the fewest openings faced these directions, minimizing exposure to the coldest winds. The main entrance, whenever possible, was oriented to the opposite side, protected from the direct wind. But protection against the wind did not depend solely on the orientation of the house. Hills, rock formations, and trees were incorporated into the protection strategy. A group of oak trees planted to the north of a house could significantly reduce the impact of icy winds. Modern studies estimate that tree barriers can reduce wind speed by up to 60% in the protected area. The configuration of the villages reflected this same logic of collective thermal efficiency. Houses were not scattered randomly across the landscape. They were grouped in compact clusters, often arranged around a central space, with side walls shared between neighboring residences. This arrangement was not just a matter of social organization or defense, it was a thermal strategy. Shared walls meant that the heat generated by one family indirectly benefited the neighboring family. The heat that escaped through the wall of one house was absorbed by the wall of the adjacent house, instead of dissipating into the icy air outside. It was an involuntary cooperative heating system, where physical proximity between houses created a thermal efficiency that no isolated residence could achieve. The entrance to the houses frequently included a kind of vestibule, an intermediate space that functioned as a thermal compensation chamber. This double-door system reduced heat loss caused by the residents coming and going, isolating the interior from direct thermal exchanges with the outside. Peasants also demonstrated an understanding of local microclimates. They avoided building in the lowest parts of valleys, where cold air accumulated during the night, preferring slightly elevated positions. They knew that south-facing slopes received more sun and oriented their constructions accordingly. All this knowledge transformed the landscape around the village into an integrated thermal protection system. And yet, even with well-built walls, an insulating roof, a strategically positioned hearth, heated stones, and an intelligently oriented house, there were nights when the cold was simply relentless. Nights when the temperature dropped so low that no clay wall, no thatched roof, no banked hearth could by itself guarantee survival. In those moments, the peasants turned to the oldest and most fundamental resource of all, the body itself. Medieval peasant clothing was much more than simple pieces of attire. It was survival equipment, carefully designed to maximize the retention of body heat, and the material that made this possible was wool. Sheep's wool was the most important fabric in the life of a medieval European peasant. It possessed qualities that made it uniquely suited for facing the cold. It was naturally insulating, thanks to the crimped structure of its fibers, which trapped large amounts of air between them. It was resistant to moisture, capable of absorbing up to 30% of its weight in water without feeling wet to the touch, and it continued to provide thermal insulation even when damp. It was durable, resistant to wear, and capable of withstanding years of continuous use with minimal maintenance. The clothing system was based on the principle of layering, a technique that modern outdoor specialists have rediscovered and mark it under the name layering system. The first layer, in direct contact with the skin, was generally made of linen, a lighter and softer fabric that functioned as a perspiration layer, wicking moisture away from the body. Over this linen layer, the wool tunic was worn, the main piece of peasant clothing. The tunic was long, reaching the knees or below them, and wide enough to allow freedom of movement during work. Over the tunic, a second layer of wool could be added on the coldest days, and over everything a cloak or cape of thick wool, often with a hood, completed the outer set. Each layer of fabric created an additional air barrier, and it was the summation of these barriers that gave the system its remarkable thermal efficiency. The air trapped between the layers of fabric functioned exactly like the air trapped in the wattle and daub walls or the layers of the thatched roof, as an insulator that slowed the transfer of heat from the body to the environment. The more layers, the more trapped air, the greater the insulation. It was a simple principle, but extraordinarily effective. Legs were protected by wool hose, and feet by leather boots lined with straw or fabric scraps. Women wore long dresses with multiple petticoats, creating pockets of insulating air. Hoods and caps protected the head, an area through which a significant proportion of body heat is lost. Peasants slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, wrapped in wool blankets and skins. A typical peasant owned no more than 2 or 3 changes of clothes, made to last for decades. Every tier was patched, and when a piece became unusable, it was repurposed as padding or fuel. Material economy was, by necessity, a zero-waste economy. The wool came from the sheep that many families kept. The annual shearing provided the raw material that, after being washed, carded, spun, and woven, was transformed into protective fabric. The entire process was carried out manually, frequently by women, during the winter months by the light of the hearth. But clothing, however efficient it was, protected only the individual. And medieval peasants knew that true strength against the winter resided not in the isolated individual, but in the group. It was in shared warmth that perhaps the most ingenious and most human of all their survival strategies was found. The human body at rest generates heat equivalent to a light bulb of approximately 75 watts. It may seem like little, but when multiplied by the number of people in an enclosed environment, the effect is significant. Medieval peasants understood this principle intuitively and used it deliberately as part of their heating strategy. Peasant families were generally large. It was common for a couple to have between 6 and 10 children, not all of whom would survive to adulthood, but who, during their childhood and youth, represented additional sources of body heat within the house. Added to this were grandparents and other relatives who frequently shared the same dwelling. A peasant house with 8 or 10 occupants could have the equivalent of 600 or 750 watts of permanent body heating, without any additional fuel consumption. In a relatively small and well-insulated environment, this collective heat could raise the internal temperature measurably. The spatial distribution of bodies during sleep was organized with precise logic. The youngest children, whose small bodies lost heat more quickly, were positioned in the center of the bed or sleeping area, surrounded by adults whose larger bodies functioned as barriers against the cold. Grandparents, more vulnerable to low temperatures, were given protected positions near the remains of the hearth, but still within the family core. The younger adults, especially the men, whose naturally higher metabolism made them more intense heat sources, were positioned at the edges, serving as a kind of human thermal wall that protected the rest of the family. During the most severe cold waves, the heat-sharing strategy crossed the boundaries of the nuclear family. Neighbors would gather in a single house, combining their bodies and their heating resources. These gatherings, born from the rawest necessity for survival, quickly acquired a social dimension. People brought food to share, told stories, sang songs, and cared for the sick and the elderly. What began as a physical survival strategy transformed into a ritual of community strengthening. The human bonds formed on these nights of extreme cold were as resistant as the wattle and daub walls that sheltered them, and they lasted much longer. In many villages there were community spaces dedicated to these gatherings. Communal halls, barns or churches served as collective refuges, where the concentration of dozens of people could raise the internal temperature by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Historical records indicate that communities that practiced this cooperative heating had significantly lower winter mortality rates. And this solidarity was expressed not only in the sharing of space and body heat, but also in the way peasants approached another fundamental dimension of combating the cold: food. The diet of medieval peasants during the winter was dominated by an item that occupied a central place on their tables and in their lives: the stew. Iron or clay pots hanging over the hearth contained a perpetual mixture of ingredients that varied according to availability, but maintained certain constants. Roots such as turnips, carrots, parsnips, and beets formed the base. Grains like barley, oats, and rye thickened the broth. Onions and garlic provided flavor and, as modern science would confirm centuries later, antimicrobial properties that helped prevent disease during the season when immune resistance was lowest. When available, meat, usually salted or smoked pork, poultry, or game, was added to the pot, enriching the stew with essential proteins and fats. This stew was not just a meal, it was an internal heating strategy. When a person ingests hot, calorie-dense foods, their body begins the process of digestion, which is, in essence, a series of exothermic chemical reactions, that is, reactions that release heat. The more caloric and complex the food, the more energy the body must spend to digest it, and the more heat is generated as a byproduct of this process. Medieval peasants did not know the concept of diet-induced thermogenesis, but they observed its effects daily. A bowl of hot, thick stew warmed the body from the inside out, complementing the external heat provided by the hearth and clothing. Fats played a crucial role in the winter diet. Bacon, lard, butter, and cheese were consumed in larger quantities in the cold months. Fats provide 9 calories per gram, and their slow digestion keeps the body producing heat for prolonged periods. Hot drinks complemented this strategy. Hot mead and herbal infusions such as chamomile, thyme, and mint were consumed throughout the day to keep body temperature elevated. The preservation of food for the winter occupied much of the summer and autumn. Smoking, salting, drying, and fermenting were the most commonly used techniques. Fermented foods, such as sauerkraut and pickled vegetables, were not just forms of preservation. Recent research suggests that fermentation produces compounds that can stimulate metabolic activity and body heat production. The pot of stew over the hearth was never completely emptied. Each day, new ingredients were added to what remained, maintaining a continuous cycle that guaranteed the permanent availability of hot food. This practice, known as perpetual pottage, was an elegant solution to the double challenge of keeping the family fed and warm. The combination of all these strategies, insulating walls, the thatched roof, the central hearth, heated stones, the intelligent orientation of the house, layered clothing, shared body heat, and a rich, hot diet, formed an integrated survival system that was much more than the sum of its parts. Each element reinforced the others, creating a protective network that allowed peasant families not only to survive the winter, but to maintain a socially and culturally active life during the coldest months. It is tempting to see these practices as historical curiosities, vestiges of an era that technology has made obsolete. But this view would be simplistic. Medieval peasants were empirical engineers who developed sophisticated solutions with exclusively local resources. Their wattle and daub walls anticipated insulation principles that engineering would only formalize centuries later. Their thatched roofs demonstrated hygroscopic regulation that still challenges industrialized materials. Their positioning strategies reflected bioclimatic architecture, presented as a novelty in sustainability congresses. Their clothing system is recommended today by brands that charge fortunes for pieces that reproduce the same principle that a 13th century peasant woman applied with homespun wool. There is therefore something more than historical interest in this investigation. There is a lesson about the human capacity for adaptation, about the intelligence that emerges from necessity, about the value of empirical knowledge passed down between generations, and perhaps most importantly, a lesson about the strength of community as an instrument of survival. Medieval peasants remind us that long before digital thermostats, heat pumps, and double-glazed windows, humanity had already found ingenious ways to face the cold, and that many of these ways, in their essence, remain as valid and as inspiring today as they were 700 years ago. The medieval winter was not just a season, it was a test of ingenuity, of solidarity, of resilience, and the peasants who faced it, armed with nothing more than clay, straw, wool, and the wisdom of those who came before, passed this test year after year, generation after generation. Their story deserves to be remembered not as a chronicle of suffering, but as a testament to the extraordinary human capacity to transform scarcity into a solution, challenge into creativity, and cold into shared warmth. And speaking of sharing, if this journey through medieval winters sparked your curiosity and warmed your imagination, consider subscribing to this channel. Each subscription helps us continue bringing stories like this one, unearthed from the forgotten corners of the past, to illuminate the present. Leave a comment telling us which of these techniques surprised you the most, or if you know of any similar practice that still survives in your region. Like this video so that it reaches other people who, like you, believe that knowledge of the past still has much to teach us. After all, as medieval peasants knew so well, true warmth only exists when it is shared.